Welcome to Covered. Today we'll be talking with Terry Jordan from the Insurance Council about private insurer progress on settling earthquake claims. Dean Lester and Duncan Webb explore the issue of as new, but right now we've sent Marcus Irvine out into the field to speak with Duncan Webb about declaratory judgment.
So the declaratory judgment that was in the High Court last year, can you just explain why it happened?
One of the issues for land in Christchurch is, as we all know, that it's more subject to flooding. And EQC wanted some guidance on whether that was damage to land, and if it was, how they would go about compensating. So they went to the court and asked for a declaration, and essentially what they asked for was a declaration that a proposed method of assessing the damage to land and also assessing how much they should pay was appropriate. So that came in the form of an application for a declaratory judgment, and ultimately that's when we found all those lawyers in the room arguing for best part of 4 days about what was damaged to land, how it should be remediated, and what the appropriate way to compensate that was.
And so what have been the takeaway points from that?
EQC had done an enormous amount of work beforehand and had a really comprehensive proposal as to a very detailed kind of flow diagram that they'd go through in order to assess whether the land was flood vulnerable. What the court didn't do was approve all of that detail. They essentially said, yes, increased flood vulnerability is damage, but we're not going to approve a really rigid system. We're not going to say that that will be right all of the time. What EQC has to do is adopt a rational system, but has to be prepared to depart from it in any case where it's clear it's not working for these people. One of the real problems is that people say, well, look, I'm being flooded, but EQC's model doesn't capture me. And it's those kinds of situations where EQC has to go along and look at the actual circumstances of that case, check that the kind of data they've got, which isn't always entirely reliable, can be relied on, or whether there's more reliable data. Because they use LIDAR, which is just after the earthquakes, a lot of aeroplanes were flying overhead, and they were taking laser-based measurements. Now, it's a good way to get a really good picture of what's happened globally, and it gets a lot of data, but it isn't always reliable because of what might be going on in the ground in terms of plants and buildings and cars and all kinds of things. It's much more reliable to actually be on the ground and take measurements, and sometimes that can be done. So they're the kind of things that need to be taken into account. There's essentially two limbs to this increased flood vulnerability question. The first is your land damaged in a way that makes it more flood vulnerable? And that's the question about, has it subsided and what's the cause of the flooding and things like that. The second question is, well, what is the right way to compensate for that? The EQC Act leans in favour of remediation, but it also gives the power to essentially pay cash. And there was a lot of discussion about how much, if EQC is paying cash, how much it should be. And what the court said was essentially that EQC can pay the loss in value of the land in some instances, but not necessarily all instances. Sometimes it simply won't be possible to remediate the land. So it won't be possible to raise the land up because you can't get a consent for it, or it's cost prohibitive. And in that case, the proper measure is probably going to be the loss in value of the land.
So where are we up to at the moment with EQC? What can homeowners expect to happen next?
I understand EQC has made some movement on that, and that they have said that they think they can have this increased flooding vulnerability question and compensation resolved by the end of the year, so that's heartening. But really the next step is for homeowners to hear from EQC about whether they're considered to be flood vulnerable or not. And a critical part of that will also be how flood vulnerable, because EQC looks at exacerbation of flooding, so they look at the increase of flood vulnerability as opposed to what people were flood vulnerable pre-earthquake, and they also look at only on-site effects, they're likely to try and exclude things like flood vulnerability due to changes to creeks or riverbeds or drainage systems. So there's a whole lot of detail going on there. So what the next thing that people can expect is to hear from EQC, and then they should look very carefully at what they receive and make sure that they're comfortable with it, make sure that EQC has the right information, including basic information about what flooding has occurred on site, and they should be communicating that to EQC.
Can we talk a little bit about liquefaction vulnerability, ILV as it's known? How was that involved in the declaratory judgment, and why was it brought forward?
Although EQC didn't raise the matter directly, the Insurance Council wanted some clarity over how increased liquefaction vulnerability would be dealt with. And so they essentially came to the court with another application saying, well, we want a declaration that increased liquefaction vulnerability is also damage, and that EQC should also be compensating that and have a compensation framework. So, and the answer to that is clearly yes, it is damage, because land which by the earthquakes has been weakened and no longer can carry the same buildings perhaps that it could beforehand is clearly worse than it was. So that's damage which EQC should compensate for. So really the question now is, how does EQC go about that? And right now they are sending geotechnical engineers around to update essentially their testing and try to determine what changes have occurred to the land and how that will affect what goes on with the land later. And again, to use the same model, the question will be, can you remediate that land? And if you can, what would it cost? But if not, what's the loss of value of the land? So essentially what would a person pay for the land in its pre-earthquake state? What will they pay knowing that it's of increased liquefaction vulnerability? And that's going to be the measure of compensation that comes from EQC.
Because increased liquefaction vulnerability was sort of tacked on at the end of the declaratory judgment, does that mean that it's going to be sort of processed and confirmed a bit later than increased flooding vulnerability?
Look, to be honest, I'm not sure what their calendar is, but certainly they were very far advanced in terms of what systems and underlying techniques and valuation methods they were using for increased flood vulnerability, and there was no evidence really as to what was going on with the increased liquefaction vulnerability. So while some of the work will no doubt be useful in terms of valuation and so on, it appears that EQC is a bit further behind on the liquefaction vulnerability.
When we come back, Dean Lester of CS and lawyer Duncan Webb explain what as new means and how to work with your insurance company in this situation.